Rain pounded hard on the windshield of the black BMW. Edward Martinez, 45 years old, CEO of the largest construction company in the country, drove in silence through the dark streets of the South Side. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. The phone had rung only once. A desperate voice screaming for help. The call dropped. But he recognized that voice. It was Michael, the 12-year-old boy he had been secretly visiting for 6 months. On the other side of the city, in a rundown apartment with leaking pipes, Michael was cornered. 3 enormous men blocked the door. Mrs. Rose, 58 years old, a janitor for 30 years in Edward's office building, held the boy by his shoulders. Her brown eyes shone with tears and determination. "They won't touch him," she whispered, placing herself in front of Michael like a human shield. "Where's the money, old lady?" growled the biggest man, a scar cutting across his face. "Your boss owes 3 months of protection money. Now he's gonna pay with interest." Michael cowered behind his grandmother. He had managed to make only one call before they smashed the phone. To the only number he knew by heart. The number that had been stuck on the refrigerator for months. But let's go back to the beginning of this story. 6 months ago, Edward was a completely different man. Cold as ice. Calculating. For him, employees were just numbers on a spreadsheet. Especially janitors. They were invisible. They arrived at dawn, cleaned in silence, and disappeared before he got to the office. Mrs. Rose worked on the 23rd floor, where the executive offices were. She had created a perfect routine. She arrived at 4 a.m., cleaned everything with meticulous care, and always left a small white orchid on Edward's desk. Nobody knew where these flowers came from. Not even Edward. He simply found them there, fresh, every morning. For years, he didn't even think about it. It was just another detail of the office. Rose's life was a daily battle. She had been raising Michael alone since her daughter died in a workplace accident. The boy was her reason for living. Intelligent like few others, Michael devoured used books that Rose found in the trash. He had an extraordinary memory. He could memorize entire pages just by looking once. But this ability was his secret. In the public school and the projects, being too smart sometimes brought problems. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any emotional stories like this one. Edward discovered Rose's existence unexpectedly. It was a rainy Friday. He had forgotten some important documents and returned to the office at 5 a.m. The lights were on the 23rd floor. He went up suspiciously, thinking of burglars. But he found a small woman, with graying hair, humming softly while cleaning his desk with extreme care. She held the white orchid delicately, as if it were made of crystal. "What are you doing here?" he asked, cold and harsh. Rose startled, almost dropping the flower. "Sorry, Mr. Martinez. I was just finishing the cleaning." Edward noticed something different about her. While other employees lowered their heads when he spoke, Rose looked directly into his eyes. Not with defiance, but with a serene dignity that bothered him. "Are you the one who leaves these flowers?" he asked, pointing to the orchid. "Yes, sir. I grow them at home. I thought it would make the environment more beautiful." Edward was silent for a moment. "Why?" Rose smiled gently. "Because everyone deserves to have something beautiful to start the day, no matter how hard life is." Those words echoed in Edward's mind for weeks. He began to notice small details. The desk was always impeccable. The papers organized in a way that made his work easier. There was always a glass of fresh, clean water next to the computer. Rose wasn't just a janitor. She cared for that space as if it were her own home. Curiosity overcame coldness. Edward began arriving earlier, just to watch Rose working. She had an almost ritualistic routine. She cleaned each surface 3 times. She organized books by height and color. She watered the plants with mathematical precision. And always, she left the white orchid in the exact position for him to see it first when entering. One morning, he arrived even earlier. Rose was on the phone, speaking softly. "No, Michael, you can't skip school. I know the boys tease you, but education is the only thing no one can take away from you." Edward heard the entire conversation. Rose was talking to her grandson, encouraging him to persist in his studies despite the difficulties. There was a tenderness in her voice that Edward hadn't heard in years. That night, Edward researched Rose in the company files. Widow for 15 years. Raising her grandson alone. Had never missed a day of work. Had never complained about anything. Minimum wage, no extra benefits. For him, she was just a number, employee 1847. For Michael, she was the entire world. Edward's transformation was slow but inevitable. He began leaving small treats. A box of chocolates forgotten on the desk. An extra meal voucher that was left over from a meeting. Rose always thanked him with a genuine smile, but Edward noticed she suspected they weren't coincidences. The turning point happened on a cold Thursday in July. Edward arrived at the office and didn't find the white orchid on his desk. Rose was cleaning in silence, but something was different. Her eyes were red. She had been crying. "Is everything okay, Mrs. Rose?" he asked, surprising himself with the kindness in his voice. Rose hesitated before answering. "Michael was hospitalized last night. Pneumonia. I didn't know if I should miss work today." Edward felt something strange in his chest. A feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Compassion. "Go to the hospital. Now." Rose shook her head. "I can't lose this job, sir. It's all I have." "You won't lose your job. Go take care of your grandson." Edward took $500 bills from his wallet. "For the medications." Rose looked at the money with tears in her eyes. "I can't accept this." "Yes, you can. And it's not charity. It's recognition. You've been taking care of me for years without me realizing it. Now let me take care of you." Like the video if you're getting emotional with this story. That same afternoon, Edward did something he had never done in 20 years of his career. He visited an employee outside of work. The public hospital was chaos. Crowded hallways, smell of disinfectant, entire families sleeping in plastic chairs. He found Rose beside a stretcher, holding the hand of a thin boy with big, intelligent eyes. Michael was awake but weak. When he saw Edward, his eyes widened. "Are you Grandma's boss?" Edward nodded, not knowing what to say. "She talks about you every day. She says you have a good heart, but it's hidden." Rose turned red with embarrassment. "Michael, don't talk like that." But Edward smiled for the first time in months. "She's right. I had forgotten I had a heart." During the 5 days Michael was hospitalized, Edward showed up every afternoon. He brought books, games, fruits. Michael revealed himself to be an extraordinary child. He spoke about literature, mathematics, history, with a depth that impressed. "He's smarter than many executives I know," Edward thought. And it was at that moment that an idea began to germinate in his mind. "Michael, would you like to study at a better school?" Edward asked on the last day at the hospital. The boy's eyes lit up, but Rose quickly interfered. "Mr. Martinez, we can't afford." "I'm not talking about payment. I'm talking about a scholarship. Michael has the potential to be anything he wants to be." Rose's joy was contagious. Tears ran down her face as she hugged her grandson. Michael, always precocious, asked a question that left Edward speechless. "Why are you doing this for us?" Edward took a deep breath. "Because you reminded me of who I used to be. And who I can become again." The following months were the happiest of Rose's life. Michael excelled at the new private school. Teachers were impressed with his learning ability. Edward became a kind of silent godfather, following the boys' progress and visiting them on weekends. For the first time in years, Edward felt his life had a purpose greater than just accumulating money. But happiness has a price. And that price was about to be collected. Victor Martinez, Edward's younger brother, had always been his opposite. Where Edward was methodical, Victor was impulsive. Where Edward built a solid company, Victor only knew how to spend money. For years, Edward covered his brother's debts out of family love. But his patience was at its limit. "You've changed, Edward," Victor said during a tense lunch. "Before you only thought about profit. Now you're giving money away to poor people." Edward remained calm. "I'm investing in people. Something you never understood." "Investing?" Victor laughed with contempt. "That woman from the projects and her kid are an investment? You've gone soft in your old age." The argument escalated quickly. Edward discovered that Victor had falsified documents to get loans using the company's name. The debts were astronomical. Worse still, Victor had promised payment to loan sharks using properties that weren't his as collateral. One of those properties was precisely the building where Rose's apartment was located. "You're an idiot, Victor. These men are dangerous." "Relax, brother. It's just paperwork. They'll never actually collect." But Edward knew those loan sharks. They didn't make empty threats. And Rose was in the middle of this mess without even knowing it. Edward tried to solve the situation discreetly. He paid part of the debts, negotiated deadlines, did everything he could to protect Rose and Michael. But Victor had gotten involved with people even more dangerous than he imagined. The group's leader, known only as Iron Fist, wasn't interested only in money. He wanted to send a message to the entire city: nobody made fools of his organization. "Your brother made us look like clowns," Iron Fist told Edward during a tense meeting in an abandoned warehouse. "Now someone's gonna pay. And it won't be him." Edward felt a chill. "How much do you want?" "I'll pay everything." It's not about money anymore. It's about respect. And respect is earned through fear. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He knew Rose and Michael were in danger because of his brother's irresponsibility. For the first time in months, he felt completely powerless. All his money, all his power, couldn't protect the two people who had become most important in his life. The attack happened on a rainy Tuesday. Rose was finishing washing dishes when three enormous men invaded her apartment. Michael was doing math homework at the kitchen table. In seconds, the piece of home transformed into pure terror. "Where's the money your boss owes?" shouted the man with the scar. Rose didn't understand anything. "What money? I don't owe anything to anyone." "Don't play dumb. Edward Martinez. He's your boss, isn't he?" Rose confirmed, still confused. "So he didn't tell you? How interesting." Michael, with his precocious intelligence, quickly understood they were in danger. Discreetly, he grabbed the landline phone and dialed the only number he knew by heart. The number Rose had stuck on the refrigerator as emergency. It was Edward's personal cell phone. The call lasted only a few seconds. Michael managed to scream help. 3 men. Grandma's house. Before one of the criminals ripped the phone from the wall and smashed it against the floor. But it was enough time. Edward was in a meeting when the phone rang. He recognized Michael's desperate voice immediately. "Comment below what you think is going to happen." Edward ran out of the meeting, leaving important executives talking to themselves. In the elevator, he called the police, but knew it would take too long. Rose and Michael were alone and in immediate danger. He drove like a madman through the city, ran red lights, jumped over medians, ignored everything that wasn't getting to them. Meanwhile, at Rose's house, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The men turned everything upside down, looking for money that didn't exist. Rose tried to protect Michael, but the criminals were getting impatient. "You have 1 hour to get $50,000. If you can't..." The man with the scar didn't finish the sentence, but the gesture he made with his hand was clear enough. Michael, even terrified, kept his mind working. His photographic memory had captured important details. The men's tattoos, their voices, the way they spoke. He knew this information could be crucial. But first he needed to keep himself and his grandmother alive until help arrived. "My grandmother doesn't have any money," Michael said with a courage that surprised even himself. "She's just a janitor." The bigger man laughed cruelly. "Is that so, kid? Then explain to me why your rich boss has been visiting you. Why he put you in a fancy school." Michael felt his heart race. How did they know that? The truth was that Victor had told everything to the loan sharks. In a moment of desperation, he revealed that Edward had fallen in love with a janitor and was spending money on her. In Victor's distorted version, Rose was a gold digger who had seduced Edward to get advantages. It was a lie, but the criminals believed it. 50,000 or the kid gets hurt," repeated the man with the scar, pointing at Michael. Rose felt her legs tremble. It was an impossible amount. More money than she would see in 5 years of work. "Please," she begged. "Take everything I have. My TV, my stove, anything. But don't hurt my grandson." It was at that moment that Michael had a desperate idea. He remembered all of Edward's visits, all the conversations they had about business and power. Edward always said that information was worth more than money. And Michael had very valuable information. "I know a secret about Edward Martinez," Michael said, making his voice sound more mature than his 12 years. "A secret worth much more than $50,000. The men looked at each other, interested. "Talk now, kid." "I'll only talk when he gets here. I'm sure he'll come to save us." Rose looked at her grandson with a mixture of pride and dread. Michael was betting everything on Edward. But what if he didn't come? What if he decided that a janitor and her grandson weren't worth the risk? Rose knew Edward's good heart, but she also knew he was a businessman. And business sometimes required sacrifices. The minutes passed like hours. The criminals became increasingly nervous. Rose prayed silently, holding Michael's hand. The boy, in turn, kept his eyes fixed on the door, believing with all the faith of a child that Edward would appear to save them. Outside, Edward finally arrived at the south side. The black BMW stood out completely from the scene of simple houses and dirt streets. He stopped the car 2 blocks from Rose's house, not wanting to alert the kidnappers. Walking through the dark alleys, he felt like a stranger in this world that Rose called home. The house was silent, but Edward could see shadows moving through the small window. His heart beat so hard he was sure they could hear it. He had brought the money, not the $50,000 they would probably ask for, but $100,000 in cash. Everything he managed to withdraw in the last 2 hours. Edward took a deep breath and knocked on the door. "I'm here," he shouted. "I'm Edward Martinez. Leave the woman and boy alone. You can solve any problem with me." The door opened slowly. The man with the scar received him with a sinister smile. Look who showed up. Prince Charming came to save Cinderella. Inside the house, Edward saw Rose and Michael hugged in the corner. Rose was pale, but Michael seemed strangely calm. "Are you okay?" Edward asked, ignoring the 3 armed men. "We are, Mr. Edward," Rose answered, her voice trembling but firm. Michael just waved, his intelligent eyes observing every movement in the room. "Let's get straight to the point," said the man with the scar. "Your brother owes us a lot of money. $100,000. Now." Edward took the envelope from his jacket without hesitation. "Here it is. Now leave them alone." But the man laughed. "It's not that simple. Your brother made fools of us. Someone has to pay for this humiliation." Michael stood up slowly, drawing everyone's attention. "Can I say something?" he said with a surprisingly firm voice for a child. "Talk now, kid. But be quick." Michael looked directly at Edward. "Mr. Edward, they said you're in love with my grandmother. That you're spending your money on us out of romantic interest." Rose turned red with shame and surprise. Edward remained serious. "And what do you think about that, Michael?" The boy smiled for the first time since the men invaded the house. "I think they don't know you, sir. They don't know my grandmother either. If they did, they'd know you don't need to fall in love with her to love her." Those simple words hit Edward like lightning. Michael had summarized in one sentence what had taken him months to understand. It wasn't romantic passion he felt for Rose. It was something deeper and purer. It was admiration, respect, family love. Rose had awakened in him the ability to love without expecting anything in return. "Very touching," mocked the man with the scar. "But it doesn't solve our problem. The money is here, but the lesson still needs to be taught." He gestured to the other 2 men, who approached Rose and Michael. "A good beating for you to remember not to mess with serious people." It was then that Michael played his final card. "Before you do that, don't you want to know about the $3 million that Mr. Edward's brother is hiding?" Everyone stopped. The silence in the room was absolute. Edward looked at Michael completely confused. What $3 million? Was Michael making it up to buy time? But the boy continued, his voice gaining confidence. "Last week, when Mr. Edward took me to visit his office, I overheard a phone conversation. His brother Victor was talking about a secret account in the Cayman Islands. $3 million he embezzled from the company." Edward felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Michael was telling the truth. His extraordinary memory had captured a conversation that not even Edward had paid attention to. The 12-year-old boy had discovered a secret that could destroy his company and his life. "Kid, you're making this up," said the man with the scar, but his voice betrayed uncertainty. Michael shook his head. "Cayman International Bank, account number 7849, Beta X. The access code is his mother's birthday, April 15, 1952. He repeated it 3 times during the call. The men looked at each other. $3 million was an amount that would completely change their lives. Edward realized the situation had taken on a much larger proportion than he had imagined. It was no longer just about debt collection. Now it was turning into a kidnapping for much more money. "If that's true, kid, you just became very valuable to us," said the man with the scar with a cruel smile. "And if it's a lie, you're going to suffer a lot before you die." Michael swallowed hard but remained firm. "It's not a lie. But I'll only give more details if you let my grandmother go." Rose immediately protested. "Michael, I'm not leaving you here alone." But Edward understood the boy's strategy. Michael was negotiating like an adult, using the only weapon he had, information. "Rose," Edward said gently, "let Michael talk." "I'll stay here with Michael and Mr. Edward," Michael continued. "My grandmother leaves and calls the police. When you confirm the money is really there, and get access to the account, you free us and run away with everything. Everyone wins." It was a risky but intelligent plan. Michael had realized the men were more interested in money than violence. If there really were $3 million available, they would prefer to run away rich than fight over $50,000. The man with the scar thought for a few minutes. "No. The old lady stays. If the kid is lying, she pays too." Michael felt the plan crumble, but didn't give up. "Then do this. Take me along to confirm the information. Leave my grandmother and Mr. Edward here. When you get the money, you release me." "Michael, no." Rose screamed. But Edward saw the determined gleam in the boy's eyes. Michael was willing to sacrifice himself to save his grandmother. It was a courage that few adults possessed. And Edward felt immense pride in that boy who had become like a grandson to him. "There's a better option," Edward said, surprising everyone. "I know my brother better than anyone. I can help you get the money more quickly. Take me and Michael. Rose stays here, safe." The men looked at each other again. The proposal made sense. Edward had access to resources and contacts that could facilitate everything. But Rose didn't accept it. "You won't separate my family. If you take Michael, you'll have to take me too." Edward admired her firmness. Even terrified, Rose wouldn't abandon her grandson. It was exactly this loyalty that had conquered Edward's heart months ago. The impasse was broken unexpectedly. One of the men's cell phones rang. It was Iron Fist, the organization's boss. The conversation was brief and tense. When he hung up, the man with the scar was pale. "Change of plans. The boss wants everyone alive and the money recovered. No violence. The police are investigating our business too much." Edward breathed in relief. The situation had been controlled by external forces. But Michael wasn't satisfied. "What if the money isn't there? What if I remembered the numbers wrong?" Edward smiled. "Then we improvise. But I'm sure you didn't remember wrong. Your memory is extraordinary." The negotiation that followed was surreal. Michael, a 12-year-old child, dictating terms to adult criminals. Edward providing information about bank accounts and international transfers. Rose praying silently, asking for protection for her family. And the 3 men, discovering they had gotten into a situation much more complex than they imagined. 2 hours later, confirmation arrived. The account existed. The money was there. $3.5 million that Victor had embezzled over 2 years. Edward was shocked by the dimension of his brother's betrayal, but also impressed with Michael's insight. "How did you know I wouldn't lie about the numbers?" Michael asked Edward while they waited for release. "Because I trust you," Edward answered simply. "And because I learned that sometimes a 12-year-old child can be more trustworthy than a 40-year-old man." The release happened at dawn. The men disappeared with the money, leaving behind only the promise they would never bother that family again. Edward, Rose and Michael were left alone in the destroyed apartment living room, hugged and relieved. "Michael," Edward said, "you saved our lives today. But you also ended my brother's career." Michael lowered his head, feeling guilty. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to hurt your family." Edward lifted the boy's chin. You didn't hurt anyone. You revealed the truth. And sometimes the truth is painful, but it's always necessary. Rose hugged the two men in her life, one 12 years old, the other 45, both brave in their own way. You are my real family, she murmured. Blood doesn't make family. Love does. Share in the comments your own stories of simple people who transformed your lives in unexpected ways. In the months that followed, a lot changed. Victor was arrested for embezzlement and racketeering. Edward took complete control of the company, implementing social responsibility policies and valuing every employee. The first measure was to increase the salary of all janitors and offer family health insurance. Michael continued shining at school, but now had a clear objective: study law to help families like his. I want to defend the little guys against the powerful, he told Edward. I want to be the voice of those who have no voice. Edward couldn't be prouder. Rose continued working, but now as cleaning supervisor, with a decent salary and everyone's respect. The white orchid still appeared on Edward's desk every morning, but now she knew he knew where it came from. It was a symbol of mutual gratitude, of lives transformed by love. Martinez Company became a reference in social responsibility. Edward created a scholarship program for employees' children, inspired by Michael's story. Dozens of poor children got the chance to study at private schools and universities. The program was called Project Orchid, in honor of the small flowers that changed his life. On a Sunday afternoon, 1 year after that terrible night, Edward was in the new house he had bought for Rose and Michael, a real house, with separate bedrooms, garden, and library. They were in the backyard, Edward teaching Michael to play chess, Rose taking care of her orchids. Mr. Edward, Michael said, moving the knight on the board, can I ask a question? Of course. Why did you change so much? Before you were known as a cold man who only thought about money. What really happened? Edward stopped looking at the board and stared into the boy's curious eyes. You know, Michael, I spent years building walls around myself. I thought being tough and distant would protect me from life's disappointments. But your grandmother taught me something very important. What was it? Michael asked, genuinely interested. She taught me that true strength doesn't come from being cold to others. It comes from having the courage to be kind, even when the world seems cruel. Your grandmother was always the strongest person I knew, and I didn't even know it. Rose, who was listening to the conversation while watering the flowers, smiled discreetly. Mr. Edward was always good. He was just sleeping inside. Michael laughed. So Grandma was your alarm clock? Edward chuckled. It was a perfect comparison. Exactly. And you, my young man, were my inspiration to want to be a better person. Seeing your courage that night, a 12-year-old child facing armed men to protect those he loves, that taught me what true bravery is. I was scared to death, Michael admitted. But I couldn't let anything happen to Grandma. And that's exactly what makes you brave. Courage isn't not being afraid. It's doing what's right even when afraid. Edward moved his rook on the board. Checkmate, by the way. Michael looked at the board surprised. Wow. I didn't see that move coming. It's like life, Edward explained. Sometimes the best moves are the ones you don't see coming. Like when I met you two. I never imagined that a white orchid on my desk would change my entire life. At that moment, Edward's phone rang. It was Marina, his assistant. Mr. Edward, sorry to bother you on Sunday, but it's about that television program. They want to do a story about Project Orchid and about how you changed the company. Edward sighed. He had become somewhat of a celebrity after his story with Rose and Michael leaked to the press. Tell them no, he replied. I don't want more spotlights. But Michael interrupted him. Mr. Edward, maybe you should accept. Edward looked surprised. Why? Because there are other boys like me out there. Other grandmothers like mine. If our story appears on TV, maybe it will inspire other businessmen to do the same thing. Rose agreed. Michael is right. Our story can help more families. Edward thought for a moment. I'll only accept if you appear with me. We're a family now. We do everything together. Rose and Michael agreed immediately. The interview aired 3 weeks later, on the highest-rated Sunday night program. Edward, Rose and Michael sitting on the couch, telling their story to the entire country. The host was visibly moved when Michael described the night of the kidnapping. "And you, Michael, at only 12 years old, had the courage to face those men?" she asked. "It wasn't exactly courage," Michael replied with his characteristic maturity. "It was love. When you truly love someone, you do anything to protect that person." "And you, Edward? What changed in your life after this?" The question he most feared, but already knew how to answer. "I discovered that success isn't measured only by what you accumulate, but by what you share. Rose taught me that kindness is a strength. Michael taught me that wisdom has no age. They saved me much more than I saved them." The program had record ratings. In the following weeks, Edward received hundreds of letters from businessmen wanting to create their own Project Orchids. Several companies implemented employee appreciation programs inspired by their story. But the letter that moved him most came from an 8-year-old child from a small town in the countryside. "Mr. Edward, my mom is a janitor just like Mrs. Rose. She works very hard and sometimes cries when she thinks I'm not watching. After I saw you on TV, I told her she's a hero, just like Mrs. Rose. She cried, but this time with joy. Thank you for showing that people like us are also important." Edward read the letter aloud to Rose and Michael during dinner. The three remained silent for a moment, absorbing the impact of those simple words. "I think our mission is just beginning," Edward finally said. And it really was. In the following years, Project Orchid expanded to other cities, other states. Edward, Rose and Michael became a kind of ambassador family for social inclusion. They traveled the country, telling their story, inspiring changes. Michael grew up and graduated law school with honors, being the class speaker. In his graduation speech, he said, "Justice isn't something that happens only in courtrooms. It happens when brave people decide to make a difference in the lives of those who need it. My grandmother and my godfather of the heart taught me that." Rose, at 65, retired from cleaning, but not from life. She became national coordinator of Project Orchid, visiting companies, training managers, spreading her philosophy that everyone deserves to have something beautiful to start the day. Edward, at 50, continued leading the company, but was now nationally known as the CEO with a heart. He gave lectures at universities, wrote a book about humanized leadership, and created a foundation that had already benefited more than 10,000 families. But despite all the fame and recognition, the tradition continued. Every morning, on the desk of Martinez Company's presidency, a fresh white orchid awaited Edward. Now it was no longer Rose who placed it there. She had trained her successor, a young woman named Anna, single mother of 2 children, whom Edward had promoted from janitor to supervisor. "The orchid continues," Anna told Edward on her first day in the new position. "Mrs. Rose taught me that some traditions are sacred." Edward smiled. "She's right. And Anna? You can come talk to me whenever you need to. My door is always open." The story of Edward, Rose and Michael proves that miracles happen every day. They're not supernatural miracles, but human miracles. The miracle of a person seeing value where others see insignificance. The miracle of a child having an adult's courage. The miracle of a family that forms not through blood, but through love. Today, when someone asks Edward what was the best investment of his life, he always answers, "A 50-cent white orchid that taught me the value of an open heart." And when they ask Rose what makes her proudest in life, she says, "Having raised a brave grandson and gained a son of the heart." Michael, now a successful young lawyer, keeps a photo on his office desk, him, Rose and Edward hugging in the house's backyard, smiling. Under the photo, a plaque with the phrase that defines his life philosophy: "Family isn't who has the same blood. It's who has the same heart." Martinez Company today is one of the largest in the country, but also the most human. Every employee is treated with dignity, every talent is valued, regardless of hierarchical position. In the building's reception, a sculpture of a white orchid receives visitors, with a plaque that tells, in few words, the story that changed everything. And so, a simple flower continued spreading its fragrance of goodness throughout the world. Because sometimes it takes just a small gesture, a simple attitude, a brave person, to transform lives and inspire generations. Rose always said, "Kindness is like perfume. You can't use it without some splashing on you too." Edward discovered she was right. By transforming Rose and Michael's lives, he transformed his own life. By giving love, he received love in return. By planting hope, he harvested happiness. The ending is not an ending, but a new beginning. Because stories like this don't end. They multiply, spread, inspire new stories. Somewhere in America, at this exact moment, maybe a businessman is noticing for the first time the person who cleans his office. Maybe a poor child is discovering they also have value. Maybe a grandmother is teaching her grandson that kindness is the greatest force in the world. And maybe, just maybe, a white orchid is beginning to bloom on someone's desk, ready to transform another life. Because love, when it's true, never stops growing. This is the story of Edward, Rose, and Michael. But it can also be your story. Because we all have the power to be the white orchid in someone's life. We all can choose to see value where others see insignificance. We all can be the difference the world needs. And you? What orchid will you plant today? Share in the comments the stories of simple people who transformed your lives. Let's spread more love and kindness throughout the world.